and I want to get started, but right up front, I want to lay out some expectations. We kind of expect that you have some basic knowledge of managing spaces, pages, and content in Confluence. If not, don't worry about it. Our examples should help make things clear, but also know, as Maggie mentioned, that this is being recorded, so you can always come back to it afterwards and re-listen. On the other hand, we also expect that you might not have as deep an understanding of information design, and especially information design as it applies to Confluence. So we're hoping to change that by the end of this webinar. And one quick note about the word information architecture and information design. Typically, we use these interchangeably. Information architecture, a fancy word for information design. And as you'll see in a bit, Brikit approaches digital workplace design from 4 established design disciplines. And we'd like to emphasize the design part, so information design. Okay, so let's talk about what you'll learn today. In this 45-minute webinar, we'll share the techniques, processes, and best practices that we've learned about why you need information design and how we do information design. In addition, we'll present some concrete steps that you can use about documenting your design, soliciting feedback, and managing risks along the way. So why bother with information design? I think there's 2 broad reasons that we can talk about here. The first is information overload. In our modern systems, like Confluence, it's simply too easy to create information, so much so that it becomes a problem to process and make sense of it in the time that we have with it. The quotes here remind us of the real cost. It's about stress, poor health, pressure, and yet our dependence on information. So information design is about reducing information overload. The second reason is what I'm going to call displacement. And I feel like this is a way to characterize those feelings of being out of place, feelings of uncertainty in our digital workplaces. And let's take a look at how this manifests in our users. This is the kind of things that we hear from users of poorly designed information spaces. For one, that there's no sense of the whole, how everything relates. And this directly corresponds to not being able to know how to get around, where to go. And uncertainty around the idea if what you're doing in the site is meaningful, or if you're doing it in the right place. In short, the feeling that you can't do anything in this space. These are all problems that lead to lack of user adoption, lack of user engagement, and I'm sure you've encountered them in sites too, either as a user or an administrator of a site like this. The fact of the matter is, if a site makes people uneasy, if it gives them these feelings of displacement, they're not going to go back. So the reason we do information design is about overcoming information overload and displacement through coordination. And I mean coordination in both the sense that it's the proper arrangement and classification of things, but also the harmonious relation of activities, why people are on the site, and facilitating their ability to do what they need to do. For information design specifically, this means setting boundaries and forms, identifying and using meaningful concepts, orienting your visitors, your users, I like to call them travelers, and your participants, the people who are contributing content and information. And of course, planning for today and tomorrow, because nothing stays the same and everything changes. So you kind of have to have an idea of what to expect, and planning helps you do that. Information design is about making information processable, about breaking it into chunks, of shaping it into meaningful forms and channeling it into appropriate use. And what I want to emphasize too is that this is for people. It's for your colleagues, for your customers, for your friends. So when we're doing this, we always have to think about how people relate to it. Okay, so that's information design in general and why we think it's important. Let's talk about our approach to it. How does Brikit do this? So if you joined our previous webinar, the next few slides will be familiar. We approach digital workplace design by integrating 4 design disciplines and using a phased and iterative methodology. Now, in that previous webinar, we go into great depth about each of these, and I highly recommend that you go back and take a look at that. For now, I'm just going to cover some relevant parts. Whenever we're engaged in a project with a client, we always like to think about our approach to digital workplace design from 4 disciplines: visual design, information design, technology design, and solution design. So for example, we believe that user engagement is a result of both a captivating visual encounter of the site combined with a sense of usefulness delivered via sound information design, thus marrying those 2 pillars of design, those 2 disciplines of design. So we kind of bear this in mind. Even as we're doing information design, we like to bear in mind the impacts on visual and the technologies, and how does it orient and relate to the overall solution that's being proposed. This integrated approach is further manifest in our methodology, which is how we get things done, how we go about doing it, our process. It is 5 phases, and within each phase, a cycle of iteration or several cycles of iteration. And I want to talk about iteration down the line because that's extremely important, especially as it relates to those concrete steps about soliciting feedback. These are our phases: define, design, build, launch, and operate. So today we're going to be talking a lot about what happens in phase 2. Here we incorporate solution design, the kind of gathering and shaping of requirements from the first phase, along with visual design and information design, in order to create a set of plans that then help you build, launch, and operate your site. So it's all kind of connected. I'd like to turn now to specifically how we do information design within this second phase. So with information design, we always start by reviewing the users, the roles, the expectation of who your users are and what they want to do, the purposes of your site, and the goals of your site. The practical aim of doing information design is to translate these things, these somewhat abstract things, purposes, goals, into real Confluence structures, into spaces, pages, content layouts, labels, etc. So first we review that, and then we center our conversations around what I'm calling the 5 fingers of information design. I'm going to be talking about these fingers in depth in a bit, but just know that these are the practices of information architecture as they specifically map and relate to Confluence. And then finally, we do this through an iterative cycle, a build and review cycle. This is our technique for collecting the important data from talking about those 5 fingers and tracking the decisions that have been made and eventually building a set of plans that can be used to help you construct and scale up your site. Let's take a look at this iteration cycle in more detail because I think it's a technique that you can take with you after this webinar. This is a cycle that we go through for when we approach each of the 5 fingers of design. So for each of the 5 fingers of design, we're going to do each one of these things, and then we're going to do several revolutions of that. So the first step is write it down. Make a table or tables for each of your fingers of information design. These are the design artifacts, and I'm going to be going in much greater detail about each one of those fingers and each of the table examples in just a bit, so you'll see what I mean. Next, take those fingers and mock it up, wireframe it. Build some test pages, build a test menu. Seeing is believing here. The next step is to let it sit. to talk about it, to think about it, to mull it over in your head. And I really can't emphasize this part about letting it sit enough. We've found through our 10 years of experience doing this that because this is a abstract translation of goals and ideas into real things, you need time to think about it. You need time to revisit it. You're never going to get all of your ideas down immediately in the first round. So that's why we always recommend this period of review, especially since you can take your artifacts in whatever state they are and present them to your stakeholders and solicit more and more feedback about it. Show them those mock-ups, show them those tables. Then take that information, take everything that you've learned and thought about, and go back, revise, repeat. Typically, we do this full cycle 4 times. And I'll say that doing this set of iteration cycles up front is really the smart and cost-effective way to do information design in Confluence, because it saves you, and we know this, a big preventable mess down the line, about 18 months out or so, when everybody's building pages. Okay, so more about those 5 fingers of information design. In the prompt, we called them pillars, but I kind of changed it to the idea of fingers because I wanted to emphasize that these aren't standalone components. They're actually fundamentally connected. They're necessarily fused together. I also like the puns around digital design and having a handy way of remembering them. Okay, so here we go. Structure. What is structure? Structure, with regard to Confluence, relates to those things like spaces, pages, page trees, the hierarchy of things. Next is taxonomy. This is all about your terminology, how they relate to labels and headings. Third is navigation, and this is about menus, signs, pathways to finding things. Fourth is permissions. These are the user and group roles and the controls around them. And finally, we have information lifecycle. And this is about workflows, archiving, and reusing content. These are the 5 fingers of information design. Now for each of these, I'm going to dig in a little bit further. I'm going to define what it is a little bit more and talk about it in relation to Confluence. I'm going to show you how we do it and how you go about planning for these things, including the tables that we use and that you can use too. And then I'm going to talk about what you get by doing this, what you get by planning it out, and why this will help your overall site design. These are the concrete steps that you can take away from this webinar. So let's get right in. Okay, structure. Structure is a hierarchical perspective of your site's content. Now, remember that Confluence sites are hierarchical. Sites contain spaces, spaces contain pages, pages contain content. So structure is about organizing your content, or the content that you expect to have in your site, into these chunks, and then putting these chunks into a hierarchy, nesting them. And you want to do so in a way that reflects the overall purpose and goals of your site. I want to mention too that structure depends on your technology. What other apps do you have and other tools do you have within your Confluence site, or do you expect to have? And the reason being is because these can open up additional structures for you to think about and plan for. So for example, with the Brikit suite of products, you get menus, page layouts, layers, columns, blocks, among other structures. And you can start thinking about how these can be nested and relate to your goals, users, and purposes of the site. So how do we go about doing structure? How do we capture this information? We start with a table, a very simple table, just like this, simple, but very powerful. And I think starting out, it probably helps to think of something like a grocery store. Let's take a physical analogy here. So when you walk in a grocery store and you kind of look above, look towards the rafters, you see each main section each primary category kind of clearly displayed: meats, produce, seafood, bakery, etc. Here you see these signs and their various sections, and yet you also understand that they're relating to a common purpose: grocery, foods, goods, that kind of thing. So you want to do something similar here when you're just starting out. What are those big, kind of large areas of your site? What do you want them to be? And the way you can start thinking about this is sometimes turning towards your existing structures within your organization. So that could be organization charts, product lists, that kind of thing. So think about these structures as you draft out this table. And I also want to emphasize, this is your canvas, your kind of chalkboard, or if you know it, your card sort, where you really have the ability here to move rows around and start organizing things. Okay, so my recommendation is write down in a row all the known pages that you definitely want to have. So you know you need a home page, start there. Create a row for a home page. Maybe you know you need a team member page for each team, okay? And a charter page, or maybe you know you want to have policies. Create these kind of rows. And you can start organizing them here as we do. So on the left-hand side, we've got spaces, kind of categorizing these pages. We've got your pages, and then reflecting the hierarchy of content, we've got the parent page. It's important to note that you don't necessarily need to have all these columns all at once in your first go-around, in your first iteration. So as we'll be seeing next with taxonomy, where we're starting to think about terms and labels, we might not want to have the label column here in this structure page. We might revisit that in a future iteration. The purpose of this is really just to get those big categories down to help you start thinking about how different pages and spaces reflect that main purpose and those goals that you want for your site. And you're going to be working in parallel with those other fingers. So you're going to be consulting your other tables that you're setting up for each finger and revisiting this from time to time. It's kind of amazing how things reveal themselves when you do a process like this. Okay, so let's move on to what we get from doing structure. Well, as I mentioned, you get those primary categories of the site. You get those big chunks of content and how you kind of describe them, hierarchically organize them. So for example, you start putting in rows, you know you want team members, maybe a team homepage and charter. This reveals this idea of a team category. And typically something like that corresponds to a space, usually a space for each of those teams. And you can see how suddenly you're starting to build out and plan in advance types of spaces, team spaces, maybe product spaces, and then types of page trees as well. You're also getting asserted belonging of content. So when a page is under another page, when a page is a child page of a parent page, you're showing belonging or ownership. And I think this is really a crucial idea for aiding users in their future contributions. In other words, this helps them see and feel comfortable and confident about where they can add content, knowing that it belongs appropriately in a kind of natural hierarchy, in a logical place. And in fact, it's not so much about users feeling comfortable and confident. It's about them doing it without the sense of uncertainty, because often those feelings, if it's successful, just don't arise. You're also getting, if you noted in the far right of the table, of the structure table, I have a area for comments. This is really a place where you can explicitly define, or at least, proximally define purposes for most spaces and even some of your pages, so that you too start to understand, okay, the purpose of this page is for this type of content, or to serve this kind of purpose, or to serve up these kinds of contents. So when you plan in advance for this kind of thing, suddenly you start to say, oh, okay, so a team space is constituted by these pages, or a resource space contains and is for these kind of things, thereby allowing you to kind of plan out in the future. If you have a new type of resource that opens up, you think, oh, okay, logically there's a place for this. It's my resources space. All of this really is about setting those boundaries that I mentioned about information design. And that was one of the ways in which information design helps combat information overload. By setting these purposes, you're also setting boundaries, what should and shouldn't be in your site. Let's move on to the next finger, taxonomy. Taxonomy is just a list of official, controlled terms for things that you care about. So official, meaning that it comes from an authoritative source. So that could be your team, the site designers. It could be, your organization's team of taxonomists, if you have one, or team of librarians, if you're lucky enough to have those. Could be your legal department. It could also be something external, like the International Standards Organization, if your list includes country codes or something like that. And the word controlled here means that the terms that you're listing out have a specific spelling and appearance. So, and this too could relate to a policy in-house. So are you spelling out all of your acronyms, or do people just know these things by their acronyms themselves? There are a lot of different ways in which terminology can be used, particularly as labels within Confluence. So as you're putting together your list of terms, don't just put together your proper terms, but start to think about the uses of these terms as labels. So they can be descriptive. They can help say what the content is about. They can be structural. They can kind of describe the type of content it is. And they can be functional. They can describe what that content is supposed to do. So for example, maybe you have news, and on a home page, you want to show the latest news. Maybe you have a label that comes from this taxonomy, a term about featured. So that could be a functional way of describing this content. And what do? We do a table, same as with all the other fingers here of information design. And I would say start just by listing those terms that matter to you. You really shouldn't be exhaustive at this point, and maybe you never should be exhaustive. It's more about what's going to be relevant, and you can always add terms later. So once you have a list of terms, maybe you know all your team names, so group your teams together, and these kind of groupings of similar terms reinforce or confirm or inform, if you haven't figured that out, those kind of primary categories that I talked about with your structure. So use that structure table to inform this and vice versa. And in later iterations, you can start to add maybe more functional designations. So that's where I would add those space and page columns, and you start to say, okay, this is a term that can be useful as a space category, as Confluence calls them, or this could be useful as a page label, or if you have a lot of attachments, if you're planning on having a lot of files attached to pages, you might want to have a column to show the purpose of that particular label. Here too, knowing your available technologies or your apps may mean additional columns for their respective functions and that kind of thing that you might want to track. And one additional note, I think it's a lot easier to have two columns here where one is a human readable name. So we see, for example, product development under team, and then the label itself for Confluence, product_development. And that's because Confluence, as you know, doesn't allow spaces or special characters in its labels. So it's useful to have both of those things, I think, especially centered around those discussions that you have with your stakeholders. And what do we get from doing taxonomy this way, of listing out our terms and grouping them together? As I mentioned, once again, you get those primary categories, and it's okay that you're getting the same thing over and over. That's sort of reinforcing it, and that's sort of the point of doing, approaching this from so many different angles and aspects. You want that. That's confirmation. you're going to get a direct application from these terms to Confluence labels. And you're also going to get those label application rules, I put rules in quotes, recommendations or guidelines. And that's what's going to be in your comment field there, that when you use the label product development, you're asserting something about the relation of that content to that team product development. And that helps people down the line, particularly if you have a special set of individuals tasked with applying labels. They know exactly how and why to apply those. But taxonomies are also really helpful for navigation headings. When you get these official terms, you can start to use those in your headings, or those primary categories that are identified can help inform those general navigation headings. In a similar way, these terms can be useful for setting a kind of de facto naming convention policy, something we actually get asked about from time to time. When people are searching across Confluence using the Confluence search or another search tool, terms that are in the page titles are going to be weighted heavily. They're going to come up higher in the relevance. So if you are using terms appropriately and consistently throughout your site, you're going to enable better search results. And using a taxonomy list to kind of disclose how those terms should be applied and used and spelled out goes a long way towards that effort. Okay, moving right along, navigation. And I think it's kind of natural to follow that from your discussions of taxonomy. Navigation is all about these wayfinding pathways and signage that enable users to move through the site and find information. You know, as a librarian, I really like the word wayfinding because I find it welcoming, that the site sort of welcomes you in and then guides you around. And it does so by helping you understand where you are when you enter the site. You're not always going to enter through the home page. So it orients you, tells you where you are, gives you that signage, and allows you to find your way around. There's never going to be any dead ends, any long hallways that you can't find yourself out when you do navigation correctly. Navigation comes in 4 types that are kind of associated with 4 areas of the page. So I want to talk about those because they serve different purposes. Your primary navigation is typically going to be site-wide or space-wide. It's going to be static and it'll appear on every page within that space or site. These things are going to be most similar to those grocery store headings that I mentioned. You know, the meats, the seafood, the produce, things that very clearly reflect the overall structure and perspective, kind of mutually exclusive, so people know where to go, which avenues to go down to find certain groupings of goods, things to do. Secondary navigation is typically a sidebar, and this could be your Confluence sidebar, but it could also be a column that you create. And it typically is going to be used to help people find their way within a space, so pages within a space. And this can also be used or derived automatically from a macro. So for example, a page tree or a children list macro. It could also be used to find anchor links within the page too. These are orienting kinds of navigation, which is to be contrasted with this tertiary kind. And this is kind of interesting, and you can get creative here because this kind of navigation dwells alongside your on-page content. So this could be things like discovery and relational navigation, so simple links, rich links. It could be macro-driven, you know, facilitated by labels. What you're doing here is making explicit relations between your content and some other kinds of content so that people see those connections. They discover something. You can lead them down a particular path. And then finally, your footer. And personally, I really like fat footers that kind of almost function as mini sitemaps. Because one thing that I think is interesting about footers is that you can restate or reorganize those primary navigation categories with a little bit more depth or a little bit more content underneath them, because by doing so, you can emphasize different paths or different ways of seeing the site. And I think it's okay to be redundant in that respect, as long as you're consistent in your headings. Redundant meaning you offer the same pathway to the same content, but also the possibility of new pathways to that same content. The fat footer is also a good place to stick links to, other organizations, other systems, other websites, and that kind of thing. And insofar as you're doing that, you're tying this site to the broader organizational kind of infrastructure of sites, which can be quite appealing and helpful to the user as well. So how do we do navigation? Once again, we're going to use tables. We're typically going to use one table or multiple tables for each of those types of navigation. So here in the top, we've got primary navigation, and I'm just doing a kind of a simple set of links here. A lot of times you see primary navigation includes drop-down links, so you'll click a heading and you'll have an option of, hopefully no more than 5, 7 links. This table is a great way to test that out without without having to build the table or without getting into the mess of things. And one thing that often gets kind of realized by doing so is that you don't need as many drop-downs, if you even need drop-downs to begin with. Too many drop-down options is going to be too much for the eye, a little bit too unwieldy. But also you might realize that you can serve the same purpose with an intermediary page. So here, that's what I'm doing with Teams products. Instead of a drop-down listing all the teams, which might be helpful, but let's say I have 30, 40, 50 teams. I might want to instead have that directly linked to a Teams page, which is a page specifically intended for browsing and searching and listing out all those teams, a place where they can kind of further navigate that. And kind of by having this table, by seeing that, by making that realization, I can then jump back over to my structure table and make a row for this and say, okay, confirmed, I want a Teams page, and here's what it's going to do. And in order to do that, here are the kind of labels or macros or lists that I need. So you can see how these are really fused together, all of these ideas fused together. I just want to jump down a little bit to tertiary navigation. Something pretty similar. Let's say, at the top of the screen, you see the all products page, and I want to have a list of my products. So here I can say, okay, here I want to use a macro to automatically generate that list, so I don't have to manually update it every time I have a new product. And the way I'm going to do that is using a space category, for example, or maybe a label or something like that. So you can already start to think about the way in which you facilitate discovery, and then more specifically, more concretely, how you do that through macros. And also here you can see a big sort of fat footer with everything sort of organized and pointing to various things. So what do we get with navigation? Well, once again, you get those primary categories. It's going to be reflective of those things. It reinforces the perspective, that sense of whole. So someone gets dropped in to the site on any given page, they can kind of take a look at the navigation and find themselves and see where they are, see what the site is all about. And you can facilitate discovery, which in turn, the more successful discoveries, the more ways in which people can discover content that they didn't know existed, but they realized that they needed, the greater your satisfaction, the greater your overall user engagement. Next up is permissions. And this one is actually so straightforward and tied to out-of-the-box Confluence that I'm not going to spend as much time on it because I think you all are quite familiar with it probably. Permissions are about the roles and purposes of your users and groups and what they can do with respect to your content. So with the permissions tables, we're typically going to do something like this, where we define the groups, we make comments about what each group cannot do, explicitly stating what your kind of out-of-the-box Confluence groups can do. And then we're also going to replicate exactly what you find in those space permissions within Confluence, but here listing out for each space and for each group what they're going to do in those spaces. This makes it so much easier for the person who's going to build out this site. They'll thank you for it. They can just take this table, go to each space, and replicate it. And we like to be very explicit in this respect because one, it helps with build out, but two, it also helps with kind of understanding and tracking why groups are doing the things that they're doing. Which is to talk about why we do permissions planning to begin with. So we define our groups, but we also do this because it's a reflection of the organization's culture. That's what's kind of interesting that gets revealed from thinking about permissions up front. Are you the type of organization where it's more, lockdown, command and control, where, people need permission in order to view a page? Or are you something more transparent, where everything is by default open to view and accessible? Or perhaps this is a way to change culture. So this is kind of an interesting way to start thinking about this. Those tables also can serve as a kind of de facto security policy. And I know, having worked in the corporate world, that project managers and managers, leadership in general, really like these kind of artifacts. They like to be able to point to something about decisions made, about who gets to do what. So if you don't already have a security policy, these tables, outside of helping you create this site, can actually serve as a kind of organization-wide policy for you, or at least department-wide or something like that. Another interesting thing about thinking about these permissions and groups and defining the groups up front is that you're also identifying users, both for your iterative cycles of feedback, but also for future evaluation, because the smart organizations know that after rollout, 6 months, a year, 18 months after rollout, after launch, you want to go back to those visitors and you want to be able to say, are we meeting your goals? Is this what you wanted? Are you able to find that information? Or has anything changed since then? Perhaps there's been a reorg, or perhaps there's a new product, and you need to start thinking about how to incorporate that into it. You can use your permissions tables to use and identify those groups for those kind of tasks later. Okay, information cycle, the last finger of information design. This is about the flow of information from its genesis to its disposition and the associated forms, rules, and policies. This is about asking what happens to information through its entire life. Should it accumulate and accrete? Does it need periodic review? Should it be archived or deleted? Once again, smart organizations know that things are going to change, and so you need to be able to kind of plan in advance how you're going to absorb those changes, but also how you're going to make it easier on yourself to create those changes or facilitate them, to eliminate duplication, things like that. Admittedly, this is going to be difficult up front, thinking about the life of a page, and that's again where you can draw from your other tables, or you could draw from your permissions tables to help you discuss that with a stakeholder group. With information lifecycle, we can make any number of tables, some of them related to workflows, some of them related to content reuse, so that's what I'm going to show you here. In this one, we're just setting up a table to talk about those different types of content. So those can be kind of revealed through your structure and taxonomy discussions. And maybe one thing that gets revealed is that you have policies that are going to be present on this site. And that might, through further discussion, help you understand that, okay, policies within our company are subject to a particular workflow. And that means, before publication, certain people need to see them. And maybe it means after publication, they need to be reviewed every 90 days and then archived after a certain period of time. And this could be tied to, an overall goal of your organization, say like ISO 9001 or something like that. So this is a table to kind of capture that information, to help you think about it. And this too will be kind of tied to what kind of technologies are available, because out of the box, Confluence doesn't give you as robust workflow tools as some apps that you can purchase. Thinking about these content types too, Helps you start planning and thinking about duplication of content. And if not duplication of content, then maybe using a form, a template, or a blueprint to stamp out future pages or spaces of this content type, thereby saving you time and effort, and maybe even a lot of pain and suffering for your future users too. So thinking about reuse of content is an appropriate thing to do during this information lifecycle consideration. So here we're listing spaces that can be blueprinted. So we know that each team, for example, in this organization is going to have their own space. And we know that each team space should have a home page, a charter page, and a team members page. And whatever else teams do, that's up to them. They can have as many other subpages that they want, but we know that each of them has to have those things. That's a really good case for a blueprint. So then your planning here helps you realize that, okay, if I plan and create the blueprint now, all I need to do is stamp out this blueprint for all my teams. That's going to be a lot easier than doing it by hand for every single team that you do. Same thing with pages too. Maybe all policies have a particular form. You can stamp them out with a blueprint. Okay, so by thinking about information lifecycle, we get content types disclosed, those policies or news, and how we deal with them, workflows, reviews, and how we tie them to maybe existing or new disposition policies. This could be, should things be reviewed? Should things be deleted? Remember, we're also trying to attack this problem of information overload. And it simply isn't true that you always need all the information that gets created in your site. It really should be subject to review and even deletion if it's not relevant anymore. We also get thinking about blueprints, how we can reuse the forms of content or actual content itself. And then one interesting aspect of this is change management plans, thinking about life cycle, kind of projecting yourself into the future, seeing how it fits with the organization's overall plans and ideas for its own future, rollout of new products, for example. You can start planning for those things now, or at least anticipating them about how and what it is you're going to do, what steps you're going to take to build that out in this site. Okay, we made it. That was a lot to take in. So let's do a little bit of a recap here. You learned about information design, and that information design is coordination. It's about reducing information overload and alleviating displacement by thinking about the right way in which your content relates to one another, and also creating it in such a way that it welcomes contributions and harmonizes them for your users. You learned that our information design is part of an integrated design approach and a phased methodology with iterations in which feedback is solicited, stakeholders are taken into account, things are mocked up, and you let it sit and think about. You learned about the 5 fingers of information design, these practices of information architecture, and how they map directly to Confluence structures and components, and how to help you apply these practices in thinking about your own site and purpose. And then you learned about the technique we use to get that data, get that information about each of those fingers down into tables, to capture those decisions, to track your thinking, so that we end up with a comprehensive set of well thought out plans to help you build a successful site for today and tomorrow. Thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Maggie.
Wow, that was a lot of information to digest and pack with tangible examples. Thank you, Andy. Before we let you go pitch a new information design to your boss, we're going to take a few minutes to go through the questions that you've asked. And I can see that there are a couple. And by the way, it is not too late to ask questions. So just look for the Q&A button and ask a question there if you'd like. So the first question I have here is actually one that we get asked a lot. And it says, you mentioned that sometimes content should go into spaces and sometimes into page trees. Can you talk a little bit more about when to use spaces versus page trees?
Yes, yeah, we do get asked about that a lot, and we encounter it. I think the main consideration here about whether your content should fit into spaces or page trees is your expected level of content. How many pages are there going to be? Can you anticipate the growth of content in this area? And by content, I mean individual pages or information on those pages. But the other kind of limiting factor or thing to think about here is that within Confluence, there's a unique page title limitation. So if you know that you're going to be creating content of a similar type that ends up having a similar title, that might be a reason why you want to split that off into spaces. So for example, the team charter. I could call my page, the name of the team and then charter. But I could also have a space for each team and then have that team charter page. And that kind of plays into thinking about the ease with which I can blueprint or template those spaces. And then I would say the final consideration between spaces versus pages has a lot to do with your visual design. Do you want to visually indicate that the user is in a different place, or do you want to visually indicate a special kind of area? In which case, if you're doing that, you might want to consider that as a space. It's easier to do that as a space than page trees within a space. So I hope that answers that question.
Awesome. A couple more questions coming in. The next one is, in Confluence, users can add their own labels, and it seems like this can lead to its own headache. And how can I prevent that from happening?
Yes. Yeah, out of the box, Confluence doesn't give you a lot of controls in order to manage labels in this respect. And here I want to draw like a maybe a more information architecture professional distinction between what's called a folksonomy or user added labels and a taxonomy. What I've been talking about is more of those officially controlled lists of terms. I think it's always smart to start with the official list. And see if you can, as you're building out the site, have those labels already in place so that they do come up when users want to add labels. They see that they're already there. They can choose from existing terms that have been controlled by you in both their presentation and their spelling and things like that. Now, there are certain apps, Brikit has some apps, there's other apps that allow you to have more sophistication and granular control over your terminology within Confluence. And that's where that distinction between what users add, the folksonomy, and the officially controlled taxonomy is a little bit more pronounced. If you're using labels in order to facilitate, search results, content that comes up through macros, you really want to ensure that those are the controlled terms that you're using. You don't want to be able to get those out of hand because that can break certain types of functionality. But it's also important to recognize that, folksonomy is a good way to surface terms that you hadn't thought of. This is almost crowdsourcing the way in which you think about describing or typifying your content. So take a look at what your users are doing in terms of the labels that they're adding, and that might be a good reason to promote those folksonomy terms into your formal taxonomy and recognize them as being beneficial and useful. So there's no reason to kind of fully cast aspersions on your folksonomy. Just know that it's something that you'll want to kind of keep an eye on, and if you can, use some apps to help you manage them better.
All right, 2 more questions, and we might have to answer the other questions one-on-one. We'll follow up with you via email. What is the role of search in all of this? Isn't search a major component in information architecture, or of information architecture, sorry?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it is missing. I didn't talk about search all that much, except insofar as the way in which labels can help filter your search within Confluence. Confluence out-of-the-box search gives you a few options, as you know, and their relevancy ranking, as I mentioned, is kind of dependent on the presence of your query terms in different parts of the page. So in page titles versus in labels versus in the body of the page itself. Within Confluence search, you're only going to be able to sort on certain things like last modified date and that kind of thing. And yet search is a really crucial aspect of information finding behavior. It's usually the way in which people kind of cut through all of those things that you've planned for and go directly to a way in which they just want to see what matches their known search term. So really the reason I didn't plan for it is because it's something that's sort of built in, and it's not necessarily something that you can plan out in tables. You're not going to be able to necessarily affect it by thinking about it in tables, except in the way in which you label content and the way in which you use your page titles, the way in which you categorize spaces. So that's why I kind of wrapped search up in both navigation and labels. I hope that answered that question.
And if not, you know where to find us. Just email us at solutions@brikit.com if you have other questions or if you want to discuss. We seriously love to talk about this stuff. Those were all the questions we have for today. We hope you found this webinar useful. Again, if you'd like to talk more, just email us, reply to the invite, or find us on our website. Also be aware that there will be additional webinars in this series, so keep your eyes peeled for an invite. I can already tell you that the next one will be on March 10th, where we will talk about visual design, so stay tuned for updates. And with that, I'm going to wish you a great rest of your day or a great evening, depending on where you are. Thank you, Andy, and talk to you soon.
Thank you all.